Markey is the executive director of the Montana State Parks Foundation, and he will talk a little bit about how he was able to use LWCF, which is Land and Water Conservation Fund, state and local grant funds to put some pretty important infrastructure on the ground at Lewis and Clark Caverns. So to get started, we know that rural recreation projects are important, and we know that rural communities really face some particular challenges in getting those great projects on the ground. Those projects are important for health and wellness. You know, people need to be able to get outside and exercise and experience nature, and especially in times of COVID. I mean, we all know those places to get outside are like gold. People are using them whether they live there or not, sometimes respectfully and sometimes not so respectfully, as we have all seen in heavily outdoor recreation communities. They're important for economic development, both for the economic drivers of tourism, but also because high amenity places that have great quality access to the outdoors attract businesses, and now attract even a new sector of business folks, which are people who can bring their jobs with them and relocate. They're called Zoom towns now, and there's a term for it. And they're people who are relocating for a quality of life, but can work remotely and depend on, number one, the quality of life, and number two, strong broadband. Which reminds me, I'm suffering from the challenge of rural communities. So my broadband is very sketchy today. And if I drop off, someone will back me up with the slides, and I'll try to call in. The other reason outdoor recreation projects are important is, you know, conservation of lands, and creating, helping the generation of stewards to recognize that wildlife and people coexist, and that we need to have people on the landscape to be able to appreciate and protect the landscape. And fourth reason that these projects are critically important is quality of life. It's a little bit of a vague term, but it's really the reason that people come, stay, relocate, remain, families stay in places because they're safe and healthy, and allow people to have economic well-being. So next slide. So we're going to be talking about the match, and we're going to talk about it like it's fitting two puzzle pieces together, but it's really not. It's really more like the picture of the jumble of puzzle pieces that are, you know, seem overwhelming. So what I thought we would do is review a couple of the key funding sources, and then turn it over to Kobe and Tina to talk about how they put those puzzle pieces together for successful recreation projects. Some of the key sources for in Montana are the Recreational Trails Program, a brand new Montana Trails Stewardship Grant Program, which I'll talk a little bit about, Land and Water Conservation Fund, both state and local grants, and federal grants, and also Montana tourism grants. Just so you know, our last episode of this webinar was about called Unpacking the Great American Outdoors Act. And in terms of increasing funding for land and water conservation funds, that passage of that act will have a huge impact on the availability of those funds. There's going to be more money, more projects, and it's going to be incumbent on rural communities to be prepared to be able to access those funds, because it's not easy, but it could be well worth it. more funds than have been available in the past will be available. So starting with the, if you could go back for 1 second, the Recreational Trails Program and the Montana Trail Stewardship Program, I'm going to lump those together a little bit. The Recreational Trails Program has been around for a long time. It's probably the most accessible program for rural communities because there is a match requirement of 20%. The Land and Water Conservation state and local grant funding is 50% match, and you have to have all your money up front. The Montana Trails Stewardship Grant Program is brand new, and it was a result of Senate Bill 24, which was passed by the last legislature, which increased the, and Kobe, step in if I get it wrong, the Montana, it's increased the light vehicle registration fee at the state from $6 to $9. And a portion of that increase is going into this grant program, which can be used as a cash match for other recreational trail programs. One of the hardest things that communities have in putting these funding packages together to create the recreation is to maintain it. It's really hard. There aren't a lot of dedicated funding sources for operations and maintenance. So that's why this Montana Trails Stewardship Grant Program, which will roll out for the first time this year, will be helpful to both help make the match, but also help communities with operations and maintenance. They were expecting that funding program would generate about $900,000, and it looks like it's actually generated $1.25 million. So that is new money that will be available. Okay, so let's talk about how to make the match with the next slide. There are two basic types of match, cash and in-kind. Cash is grant, it's obviously new money, so it's grants, it's foundations, it's private donations. It's an allocation of cash on hand that a community or a nonprofit may have. With regard to grants, sometimes, particularly for public grants, there's a restriction on the type of grant and type of money that can be used for a match. For example, you can't match, generally speaking, though there are exceptions, which are super important, but you generally can't use a federal grant to match a federal grant. So the way that the funding puzzle gets put together is you just have to make sure that the money and grant money that you get is eligible to be used for the match. One of the great things for some of these programs, particularly RTP, is that it has a very, you can make the match with in-kind contributions up to a limit. And those in-kind are volunteer services if you have donated lands and buildings, donated space, donated equipment. But a lot of communities use volunteer services, whether it's municipal employees, whether it's the local church group, whether it's just another group getting out there and pulling weeds and doing some digging. All of those hours can be used toward making the match for some of these projects. Okay, so now that's the bigger picture. So now I'm going to turn it over and talk about how it actually really works on the ground, how some of these puzzle pieces of both funding sources and types of match have been put to work on the ground. So Tina, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what you all were able to do in Libby.
Hi, I'm assuming I'm unmuted now. And you can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Great. So yes, I am definitely focusing on the greater Libby area for this presentation. We can switch to the next slide. You know, Libby is a small Montana, typical Montana rural community. And I'm assuming there's lots of folks on this webinar from rural communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, because that has a great impact on how you move forward. I suspect most of our communities do not have a robust economy. Therefore, there's a lot of things that fall in place, and I'll put them in an order. They may not be the order of this slide, but because you probably have a limited local property tax base to assist, and that is often illustrated by the fact that you will have limited paid professional positions supporting community and economic development. Your city may not have a community development manager. The planner for the county may be more focused on regulations rather than looking at progressive and future opportunities and putting those in place. Therefore, you rely on volunteers, and in little communities, volunteers are repeating their effort in multiple organizations. So you get volunteer fatigue, and this fatigue is coming over decades. And so sometimes you're dealing with local communities, small populations that haven't changed much. There's a lot of personality issues, some personal grievances, all can be fixed. Absolutely, they can all be dealt with. It just takes more time, more patience, more appreciating of the need for and the value of communication. You also deal with what I'll call silo-centric communities, where there's a lot of organizations, but they all have their silo of interest, and they become redundant and overlap and repetitive, and no one's talking to anyone because, of course, you have limited volunteers and they're fatigued. So it's all one big mashed up plate, isn't it? And most likely, I'm hoping there's lots of exceptions, but most likely you have no meaningful local foundation dollar support. That's real helpful to get match. That's another example of a source of match. But in our rural communities, that's probably not there in a meaningful way. So going on to the next slide, the funding sources and the strategies behind that. Grants can be cumbersome, especially remember the fact that you probably don't have paid positions managing all this. I often refer to it as a bit of a pyramid scheme, in that you're getting money from the federal government, which is funding another program with a mission for this, which now funds, and then now funds, and then now funds. So you have these various levels till it gets down to the project owner going after the dollars. And it's also, because Diane referred to some of these grants or funding sources, there will be different eligible uses. And first thing you really need to do is strike a relationship with somebody at that organization to find out what those eligible uses are, because you don't always want to be the one interpreting them. Most of these folks are really trying to figure out how to get your project under their umbrella, and they will do everything they can, but that requires a conversation of how to position it. So you have to be prepared to finger joint multiple sources. Your match could be created by another grant. Your match could be created by 2 other grants. So it's a real finger joining. And remember, if they have slightly different eligible uses, how do they fund that part of your project which is allowed? So a lot of strategy thinking, sequencing. Therefore, you have to do sequencing of both your projects, your timing, and the cycle of these grants. Maybe you're in a planning stage and many grants don't fund planning, or vice versa. You have to be aware of that, and that goes back to an overall strategy, and this is probably from a volunteer, so you can start to see the challenges of this. And there's a lot of good grant money out there that funds other nonprofit organizations or foundations to lend a part-time or temporarily a specialist to a community to come in and help them with their community initiatives, or even assess and create community initiatives. That's great, but those dollars disappear. That's not someone living and embedded in the community. So that has a vulnerability to it. And so you have to, and you really want to use that person, but you've got to understand the limitations and how to leverage them the best you can. I'm going to use that as an example here a little later on. So what do you need? I use this word all the time, strategies. You really need to have project strategies. You're not just creating a walkway so kids can get to a park. What's your whole urban trail system need to look like? And therefore you probably need to establish a plan. And we're going to talk about that as the first step we took in Libby. You need a writer. People these days don't like to write anymore, but you need a writer. Hopefully they can be a storyteller. You need visionaries who, again, it's not just a walkway to the park. We need an urban trail plan. And as you all know, if you're on this phone, you need passion. You got to get really excited about the possibilities. I'm going to use this example again and how critical it is and what was and is to Libby. Ideally, you would have an elected official as your champion. If not, that can't always happen, of course, other leadership people of leadership positions in your community as champions to this. So you really want to have conversations or let them feel a big part of this. You want momentum for the cause. You want lots of people to know what you're trying to do and get them excited, very intrigued, and ideally, again, feel like they're a part of it. And of course, lastly, but most importantly, you want capacity to manage frustration. You will have a lot of frustration. We all want these things done now, not in 5 years. We don't want people in the way. We don't want the roadblocks. There's always a way around them. So that little cousin frustration of yours that sits on your shoulder, you need to manage that. You can see me personally if you want some ideas. I have
I'm laughing about that. Kobe and I are both nodding our heads. Yeah, it's hard. That's a hard one.
You learn a lot of personal skills, advancing your own personal skills in this process. So we can move on to the next slide. I'm going to call this a tipping point because there are those spots of magic out there where everything shifts, no matter how small that shift is. If it didn't happen, you're in inertia, you're dead in the water. And again, remember I'm drilling down to my experience in the community of Libby. So in about 2014, we had one of those nonprofit organizations that gets funding to come in and help local communities address their issues. And that was Friends of Scotchman's Peak. And they were doing community prosperity forums, evening discussions on topical subjects that would be interested to a rural population, more isolated. So this was really, when I read about this and saw it in the paper, I thought, my goodness, who are these people? This is fantastic. I want to talk to them. I introduced myself and they asked if I would help with their next subject. And back in 2014, I wanted to talk about the value of an outdoor recreational economy. I brought people in from outside the community who had moved project forward in like size, scaled down communities like a Sealy Lake, for instance. But I also brought folks from inside the community who were working on some pretty interesting projects to all gather in the same room to talk about how, not unlike what we're doing right here, the challenges and their workaround of how they move things forward. It was a packed house. I truly did not expect that, which informed me of something important. It was an exciting house. There was very good energy in that room. What does it mean? What do we do next? What do we do with that? You have all these great meetings. I call them so what meetings, because what do you do with it? And I'll talk here in a minute about that. And the cost was free. There's no grant funds to create those moments. So we're going to the next slide. The second tipping point was, I was trying to think of some additional background. I think I was talking to the National Parks Foundation. The gentleman, he lives in Bozeman, Montana, and I'm sorry, his name escapes me. Someone just said, call this person. And what can we do here in Libby, Montana? And he said, well, here's some things we can get involved in, but you have to at least show you've thought through what you need and have a plan. So, a plan. So the tipping point number 2 was, well, we'll do a plan, right? And we did. It was the Greater Libby's Trails Plan. It was 71 pages with maps and beautiful photographs. A lot of community involvement with this, people who were working on it. Truly, it was not a trails plan. It was more an assessment of what was going on underneath the radar, unconnected to each other, that almost nobody knew of all of it. And so it was more an assessment of these major pods of activity going on around Libby. And remember, Libby is not looking at a view shed. We live in the view shed. So this is something that's a mile from your house, no matter where you live. And again, we had great community involvement. People, worked with the contractors, took them all around, showed them what the visions were for these different areas, supplied them lots of maps. They were a lot of participation. So that's great. Let me talk about the funding, because I don't think this was mentioned. The funding from that came from the state of Montana, Big Sky Trust Fund, and this was for project planning. There's another one called Job Creation. This is for planning, and because trails and outdoor recreation is seen as has economic value for Montana, we could source the Big Sky Trust Fund for planning to create this trails plan. They did about half of it. Cabinet Peaks Medical Center had some money that they were supposed to put into urban walks, but there was no plans for it, so they offered to add some to it. Our Libby Parks District in our county, we have 3 different parks districts, which get tiny, tiny bits of mill taxable dollars. The one in Libby offered to put some money in, and Lincoln County put some more money in. Why this worked is because our match was split up into three ways, and so no one really had a burden. Well, that is a lot more administrative work. Sometimes that's what you got to do, and so that's how that got funded, since we're talking about funding sources. So next slide. The next tipping point to me was transformational, and that is the completion of this plan, because all of a sudden we see 71 pages. There was a presentation, highly detailed, talking about all these different areas. Folks didn't know what each other was doing. Again, silo-centric. But the completion of that plan, as I look back, it was confidence. There was a trust in, well, we are doing a lot of things, certainly pride. And I love this word, an aspirational moment. And yet, probably the most meaningful, significant thing it did was, the plan had a page of recommendations to move this forward, and one was to establish a paid position to move it forward. Not quite sure what that meant yet, but that was necessary. It couldn't go on with just a lot of unconnected volunteers. Our county, our city, and the Libby's Park District came together. That was amazing in itself, and funded a Trails and Rec position to move that plan forward. And the second thing that happened was the Libby Outdoor Recreation Association was formed. Clumsy, it's been formed for 2.5 years. It's made up of many, many landowners, and those are federal, state, county agencies. And then of course, all the project movers and shakers. So, but all of a sudden, once a month, once every 3 months, we're all sitting around the table saying, where are we? That's a phenomenal for Libby, Montana. So I want to be aware of my time here. Next slide. So in this plan, I told you there was these many, many pods of activity. Well, I'm going to talk about one pod of activity, and that starts with another plan, and it is the Cabinet Range Recreation Development. This was actually 31 miles. That's a lot for one plan in Libby, Montana. It's made up of 5 components, 5 physical sections, but because they all connect and they're what I call linear trail section, we felt it would be most intriguing to put it under the heading of one plan. It goes, like I said, under 31 miles. There is there's the development of 5 miles of a mountain bike course in this. There's also a big Nordic ski area. There's 4 different landowners. Yes, it is ambitious. It's happening. It is happening. And within these 31 miles and these 5 different physical sections, I'm not going to give you an example from one portion of this, and that's the next slide. That is what we call our Flower Creek ski area. That's the Nordic ski area. That in itself could have its own subplan in this. Technically it does. So I'm using this, highlighting this because it has the main, at the moment, the main public access closest to Libby to the whole 31 miles of different and diversified activity. So that the needs on this area that we need to go after grant funding or any kind of funding for is new trails, improved trails, drainage. It is right above the Libby water source. So it gets a lot of scrutiny. There's a big parking lot there. We need signage. Believe it or not, we have a very, very nice biathlon range on this site. Restrooms, of course, there. We just recently put in a structure that's a warming hut to get people out of the weather, to sign up for races, to have locker rooms when they're grabbing their skis for our youth development teams. So it's also a visitor center when they come up there, and we use a part of it for a maintenance shed. And the road getting to this area, there's been a lot of successful negotiation with the Forest Service to get this road improved and move a closing gate a couple miles down the road. Those are big, frustrating challenges. So let's talk a little bit about the funding strategies on those type of activities. So I have, as you can see, I have a source of grants, and then I'm showing the source of match. Some of these grants were already listed. Montana Tourism Grant is great. They are so good to work with, and you learn so much from our folks at the state in tourism. They are looking, remember when I told you about, they all have their needs, they all have their little, what they consider eligibility, what their mission is. These are grants that you must be able to show why it's going to increase visitation. I love visitation. That's in a place like Libby, that's your first date with an outside visitor. They may decide to stay. They may bring business skills, civic entrepreneurship. They may create a small business. They're going to create property tax. I love visitors, so this was perfect for us. We've already talked about the Recreation Trails Program for through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the RTP. There's also in that same group shooting range development grants. Remember, we had a biathlon range that was created. NRA came to our help with that. And just because we're doing trails in a ski course, because they're around a biathlon range, the NRA likes that. So that's how you start pooling common missions to get what you want. So pooling the missions is also finger joining these grants. RAC grants, that's what your national forest, in our case it's the Kootenai National Forest, has something called RAC grants that you can, very competitive, but you can go after money there. We have a Lincoln County Community Foundation, but in our case, they have $9,000 a year to spend in all of Lincoln County. Very small, but that doesn't mean you can't get some assistance from them. Our Libby Parks District, I already talked about them. And since COVID, there's some social service grants out there. You want to be very, very wise to the Kootenai Nordic Club was successful in getting some, as well as Kootenai River Development Council got some on behalf of projects they help to support, like the Kootenai Nordic Club, who's on this piece of land. Matches. Remember when I told you about the elected official as a champion, how very, very important that is, because our commissioner in the Libby district, Mark Peck, is highly behind these projects. Our Lincoln County Road Department for the Libby district, we also, the gentleman who is the road manager, some of these are his projects. So he definitely will pool some resources, equipment, some machinery for projects as he can slot them in. That's probably our biggest ace in a hole. Thank goodness for that. The city of Libby has come through. They've also done some work. For instance, they own a portion of that ski area. We've had some personal donors who were so intrigued and appreciative of, these ambitious but really aspirational, energy that was being applied. And then, as was already mentioned, volunteer hours. Again, you have to be careful because one grant will use these type of volunteer hours, another grant will allow these type of volunteer hours, and some of them don't allow any. So you have to get very wise on multiple sources and then finger joint them in. It's called sequencing. So as I mentioned earlier, the finger joining, the sequencing of this. As you go to the last slide, the slide before that. So what's going on there is you can see one grant, the tourism grant, helped establish our building up on the ski course because visitors come in and use it. We have outside competition using it. They love that. So we work with them, the city of Libby, personal donors, and the Libby Parks District to get that building erected and created. Another example is the biathlon range. So there we work with shooting range development grants. We work with the NRA and we work with the Lincoln County Road Department. When it was built, I'm sure we also worked with RTP for that, to build the biathlon range. So again, we pooled multiple resources to get that going. So it is a house of cards. You need to stay very organized to take advantage of the timing and cycle and eligibility of grants. You have to be able to story tell your project to make sure it fits within their mission. And it's still going to be a jigsaw puzzle. So that's my last slide. That's really all I have at this moment. Thank you.
Oh, Tina, I have 100 questions. I think we're going to have to bring you back just to drill down on one of your projects, because I think what it does is it highlights the challenges and ingenuity that rural communities face, particularly those that don't have an open space bond or they don't have county funding, dedicated funding available. I am the founder of the Whitefish Legacy Partners and Whitefish Trail. And so I know on the ground how important it is and I call it a crux move. Tina calls it a tipping point. Having a good plan is. A good plan will stand the test of time and allow you to put those puzzle pieces together in whole or in part. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kobe Gierke. He has a little bit different kind of project. It's a project that provides alternately abled people to be able to access a state park. And the main funding source, Kobe's got a couple different projects, but I wanted him to talk a little bit about LWCF stateside, which is a little different funding source than Tina has used, and just sort of talk about how those private in-kind pieces fit together to actually get something on the ground. Kobe, take it away.
Hello. Thanks, Diane. Thanks for having me on this call today. Happy to come in and talk about some of the work that the Montana State Parks Foundation has done recently. I'm going to talk about two projects, probably going to focus more on our Lewis and Clark Caverns project because it was a little more large scale and a lot of moving funding pieces that are fun to get into. But before I say all of that, a good plan is critical in doing all of this, but I would push it even a step back further. If you're a community or a foundation or a small organization like the Montana State Parks Foundation, you better have a mission you believe in, because you are going to lean on that mission more and more, and particularly in the frustrations that you are sure to encounter that Tina talked a little bit about. That mission is critical. You have to be able to have something that you believe in and that you can rally people around. Otherwise, dealing with the bureaucracy will beat you up. So make sure you start from a really solid foundation of a good mission, build a solid plan on top of that, and then you get to execute some fun projects and hopefully enhance your communities. So at Montana State Parks, our mission is to enhance the visitor experience at Montana State Parks for all forever. So when we talk about doing that, enhancing that experience for visitors is all sorts of different things at state parks. When we started looking at opportunities at our parks, we wanted to focus on some of the busiest and oldest parks in the system, like Lewis and Clark Caverns, which is the first state park in Montana. We knew that this park sat on a number of different cross-country cycling routes that Adventure Cycling out of Missoula had identified. We knew that it was ripe for development of a hiker-biker campsite. There was the infrastructure largely in place, just the structures themselves didn't exist. And we knew that the state was doing a number of other projects at the park. There was a large-scale upgrade to the lighting system within the caverns going on when we started discussing this hike and bike campsite. Well, so why am I showing you a picture of a shade shelter, which is actually right at the exit of the lower caverns? This is how we met the Land and Water Conservation Fund match, was this structure right here. We donated it to the state of Montana to use as a 50% or a 1-to-1 match on stateside Land and Water Conservation Fund dollars, so that the state could come in and build the hike and bike campsite. So overall, we were looking at about a $150,000 project. Our donation of this shade shelter, all of the planning and construction efforts that went into it, were the match that were required. But now, how did we get there? How did we actually get the money? How did we figure out how to do this match? So let's look at the next slide. So, like I said, Montana State Parks was working on the lighting system inside the caverns. Their project came in under budget. They had leftover LWCF stateside money encumbered in the park of Lewis and Clark Caverns. They were looking at taking that money and doing something else with it, moving it to a different park, making it a part of a deal for some other place. And we said, no way, that money is already, it's already dedicated to Lewis and Clark Caverns. Give us an opportunity to match it. And so that was the agreement we started off with Montana State, with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And we went out and we said, all right, there are two major components that need to happen. We want this hike bike campsite, so we have to match the funding. The park is also asking for a shade shelter where they can begin and end tours of the Paradise Room of Lewis and Clark Caverns, which is accessible to people with mobility limitations. The normal tour is pretty arduous. They actually had a fatality on that tour. A gentleman passed away on the hike to the upper caverns entrance in 2017. And so the park was really looking for opportunities to allow people with different physical abilities to access the caves. They could do that if they had a shade shelter at the lower entrance to time the entrance into the lower caverns so as to not interrupt the other people taking the traditional tour and to keep them out of the direct sun and rain that are frequent there. So by building this, we opened up that lower tour to about 12,240 more visitors a year. So mission, enhance the visitor experience. How do we do that? 12,000 more tours for people who have mobility limitations. Win-win is we then could donate this structure to match the LWCF need to build the bike camp down below. So in order to do that, we had to identify a number of different funding sources. We couldn't just say, well, we got a bunch of volunteer time to lead tours, but we still don't have the structure. We have a bunch of volunteer time to build the bike campsite, but we still don't have the match for LWCF. So we reached out to the Montana Office of Tourism and Business Development, someone you just heard about in the past, and we worked on a project or on a specialty grant called a Destination Development Grant, where we used some of their funds to develop the shade shelter. We also got some funding from AARP. The American Academy of Dermatology has a specific shade shelter grant. So what do you know? That worked out perfect for us. The Montana Gift Corral has a gift shop located a half mile from this structure, and they're great park supporters. And we've got a number of really strong private donors that love Lewis and Clark Caverns State Park. But I want to highlight one, and that is the Jefferson Valley Community Foundation. They were the first in. They gave us $2,500 when this project was in its infancy, we thought we were going to put up some steel posts and erect a canvas top on top of this. Well, that things changed, but that was what Jefferson Valley Community Foundation is, a tiny foundation, kind of like the Lincoln County Community Foundation. But the fact that they were willing to embrace this project from the outset really gave us a lot of strength in our applications when we went subsequently to the American Academy of Dermatology, AARP, et cetera. So getting that first funder in the door is something that you just can't overlook. It's really critical, even if it's a small grant. Ask for a long timeline because it's going to take you a long time to fulfill their intent, but that first piece is critical. Let's take a look at the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just finish up by saying we were able to take all those different funding sources and pool them, none of them, particularly large grants, but we were able to pool all those different funding sources and then hire a contractor, build that shade shelter, donate it to the state of Montana, and use that donated value of the structure as the cash match, or I guess in this case, perhaps an in-kind match for the LWCF funding to build the bike camp, which is ongoing right now. So that was the mechanics on the funding for that project. But again, a lot of hardship, a lot of frustrations. Diane and I, we were having a conversation the day before Thanksgiving a year ago about, is this thing going to fall apart? Are we going to lose this project? But, again, lean on your mission, lean on a good plan, and you can get through a lot of that tough stuff. Okay, so now let's talk quickly.
Kobe, before you go on, I probably need to make a disclaimer. I'm also the founder of the Montana State Parks Foundation. I was appointed to the first state parks board by Governor Bullock, and learned during that time that there just wasn't a dedicated private partner, philanthropy partner for state parks. So my colleague Jeff Welch and I jumped in, formed the foundation, and the first and best decision that we made was to hire Kobe as the executive director. So, okay.
Let's take a look at the next slide. So that was LWCF. Again, that was held by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. That wasn't a grant that I applied for. That was funding they already had for that park that they were considering taking elsewhere, and we were able to make the match and do double the work at the park, essentially. But I want to talk about a different project, which is Wild Horse Island, another rural park. This one is in what they call the primitive parks list. So development is very limited on the island, but maybe it should be. It's an amazing place as it is. Needed to do some access improvements. There are 6 landing sites on the island, all of which were following the visitor information was not up to date. It was inaccurate and was in disrepair. And then the trails throughout the island were in disrepair as well. And that was leading to some negative interactions between park visitors and the wildlife that make the park so special. So let's take a look at the next slide. We looked at this and we said, hey, at our core, we've got a trails and access project where we need to do some habitat improvements as well. So who funds trails in the state of Montana? Recreational Trails Program funds trails in Montana. So that was our first identified grant of like, hey, we should do that. But then we thought, who else would take interest in Wild Horse Island? State parks are not necessarily always equated with the fish and wildlife side of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. But Wild Horse Island is a unique property with some of the best wildlife habitat in Montana and some of the best opportunities to view that wildlife project. But we need to do this habitat work as well. Who would pay for habitat restoration? And we looked at the wildlife groups that are so often not brought into the conversation about recreation, particularly front country recreation. So we went to folks like the Mule Deer Foundation and the Wild Sheep Foundation. We went to Onyx Maps, which is a technology solution largely for hunting and angling. And we approached those folks and we said, look, this is a world-class wildlife viewing opportunity. People are going to be more inclined to donate to your foundation if they go out and they see amazing wild sheep on on Wild Horse Island, which is where the world record bighorn came from. And they bought that. And so essentially we were able to make the match with RTP by leaning on sort of unconventional partners, both in the private sector and other foundations that typically wouldn't get involved in front country recreation. So I bring this one up as an example of thinking creatively and working with partners that you maybe wouldn't typically think would fund this sort of thing. I didn't think that the Mule Deer Foundation would take any interest in preserving habitat on an island where you can't hunt mule deer, but they certainly did. So don't weigh out your options until you've vetted them a little bit. Essentially, we used the funding from these sources that you're seeing here to match the RTP funding. We had some volunteer time as well, and we were able to get all this work done using crews from the Montana Conservation Corps, another really nice resource we have in the state. As an alumni of MCC, it's a great opportunity for young people to get experience working on the land, doing conservation work, and growing as individuals. So there's my quick plug for MCC too. That's about what I have on those two projects. Diane, is there anything else you wanted me to touch on?
No, that's great. I mean, again, I have 100 questions, but why don't we wrap it up and open it up for questions if there are any. If folks don't, I have lots of questions. So I wanted to just wrap up by saying there's a lot of opportunity in the outdoor recreation space, and you may have heard the term front country. It's a term that I use to describe basically developed places that people can access nature close to home. That is the unofficial definition, but as opposed to backcountry, I think of it as the places that we go every day, where we take the kids, we take the family, we spend a weekend. You don't have to drive very far, and you can actually get a nature fix. For rural communities in particular, those spaces are maybe a little bit underutilized or not taken for granted. But I think that with the increased funding resources, not ever enough, so don't get me wrong, but I think that that preparing with smart, sustainable, inspired recreation projects that tie into a larger plan, like Tina talked about and Kobe, I just think that there will be a bit more resources to be able to deploy on the ground. So our next path ahead will be an insider sneak peek at the Montana Outdoor Recreation Summit that is scheduled for October 13th and 15th through the 15th. It's a virtual summit this year, but it brings together thought leaders in education, healthcare, outdoor recreation industry, gear, to think about how we how the outdoor recreation economy remains and built in Montana resiliently for the future. So we'll have a little sneak preview. Sign up for the Business of Outdoor Recreation Summit. Like I said, it's the go-to source for what's happening now, what's happening in the future, COVID, how our resources are being utilized, how we develop, sustain, create, and have inspired places to recreate outside. Our next path ahead will be Best Project Ever. That's my working title right now. But it's to introduce the Montana Trail Stewardship Grant Program, which is brand new. Talk about how we're assuming that the increased funding from the Great American Outdoors Act is going to hit the ground. How rural communities can prepare to compete for those new dollars. Some of it will be a little bit new. Some of it will be, using the same processes. But the fact of the matter is there will be additional resources. So thinking about how to position rural communities best to be able to make the funding puzzle that Tina talked about. And then a heads up, the application period for RTP, LWCF stateside, and the first ever stewardship grant program is tentatively scheduled to open on November 2nd. It will follow the same funding cycle that they have, and close in February with awards happening in the summer. But that's all in the works. So we're gonna be talking on the 27th with Michelle McNamee from Fish, Wildlife and Parks about how those funds are gonna hit the ground, and then just keep talking about it, because it's sort of it's new territory for us. So now, oh, okay, I was gonna leave 15 minutes and we have 7 minutes. So are there any questions? Did we get any on the chat? Okay, I have a couple of questions as we wrap up here. Tina, I have a question for you, and particularly for the role of local government, because in Flathead County, and what we have found with the Whitefish Trail is we do have a good partner in the city, but we don't have a strong partnership with the county. Can you talk about how important that has been for you in your project?
Yes, I'm assuming you can hear me. I'm unmuted. It is very important because, and the way we do this, let me talk about the way we do this, is all counties have a day of the week where there's public meetings and you get on the agenda to talk about projects, whether you need them to vote or agree or take any action or not, just to let them know what's going on in their county, or even if it's in a city. So that's a good starting point, but I believe it's important, and probably more so in rural communities, because first of all, their support behind a project, if it's being funded by a granting up organization, can be very important, that the county's all in on this, knows about it and agrees and appreciates the project. You may be asking them to do some work, not that it comes out of their budget so much, but they could be in the area. It's very easy for them just to help with some of the construction going on. And sometimes they have to be the ones, because maybe you're asking them to improve a road access. All the more reason to keep them in the loop. So to ask them to be part of it or support it when you don't have a path to keeping them in the loop, that is easy for them, because you can imagine all the things they're dealing with, but something that they're not, no surprises for them if, and especially when you could have other private landowners that may go to them and complain about something. If they know in advance what's going on, I think that's really important. So that just keeps them in the loop. But if you want them to actually do more than keep in the loop, probably in the part of the county you're talking about, you have one commissioner that probably, I think, comes from that part of the county. I think that's how Flathead works too. They should be at some of those meetings to see what the pulse is, what the energy of those groups are. I would definitely invite them in and engage them and make them feel that they are involved and expected to be involved. Funding for them to write a check probably will not happen, but there's no reason you can't go to them and say, can you lend a hand on, would you be willing, that's all you can do is ask, lend a hand on some of the work we can then count as in-kind match. Especially when it's spelled out, they understand the limitations and the boundaries, so they have confidence they're not getting themselves into something more than they need to be involved in. I think that is very legitimate request once you have introduced them to the activity at hand. But yes, I would get them involved. And it's not so much a way to sell. I mean, you can do it from different angles. This helps our economy by being more attractive to visitors. Interestingly enough, now, do we want more visitors? So we've got that big dilemma going on, but it brings quality of life to the voters and their families. So there's a lot of legitimate reasons to get them more engaged. So hopefully I'm answering your question, but I think it's very important, very important.
Thank you. Yeah, Tina. Kobe, I have a question for you. You mentioned the at Lewis and Clark Caverns, the multi-uses that go through the park and with the park. Can you talk a little bit about how user groups are either engaged or not engaged in park maintenance, development, etc.?
Sure. So Diane's, I think, subtly alluding to the fact that, Lewis and Clark Caverns historically was, a place to go experience the cave. And then, it sort of morphed into a great place to go camp and fish along the Jefferson. And in recent years, it's really become a destination for mountain biking, and particularly in the early and late season as the Gallatin Valley has developed and more recreationalists living in the Gallatin Valley, they find that the dry west end of the valley, which is Lewis and Clark Caverns, is dry and snow-free much sooner than the trails near Bozeman. So those recreationalists, the mountain bike community and clubs out of the Bozeman area, put in a lot of work every year developing and maintaining trails at Lewis and Clark Caverns. We do our part, and we try to host those events, typically around Earth Day each spring. I think we had about 75 volunteers out 2 springs ago. We didn't do anything this last spring for obvious reasons. But yeah, those user groups, particularly the mountain bike communities, tend to be very motivated to get out and maintain the trails that they use. You'll find that also with groups like the Backcountry Hunters, Backcountry Horsemen of America. You'll find that with, different hiking clubs will do the same, but those are really, really valuable sources of in-kind match. And also, if you're like most communities or even land management agencies, you don't have a huge staff to go out and volunteer and to go out and maintain your trails infrastructure or recreation infrastructure. Volunteers can help supplement that very well.
Thanks, Kobe. Well, it's noon and we're going to wrap up here. I do thank you. I, as a person who has created recreation on the ground from scratch, I found myself wanting to have a community of people to call. Now Tina's on my list. But sometimes we think that we're all facing this challenges uniquely. We don't know who to reach out to. We want to know who helped Tina with her plan. We want to know how Kobe was able to find some of those resources. So we're putting together a Facebook group. It's a private group, closed group called Front Country Alliance. And it's just starting to make these connections among communities that are facing the same challenges, and particularly around volunteer fatigue and a lack of capacity at the local government level, and volunteers who are not, reinventing the wheel, but maybe could learn from the experiences of others. So with that, we'll keep talking. And we'll keep having these chats, and hopefully folks will feel free to reach out to each other, and we'll wrap it up and see you the next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Thanks, Tina. Thanks, Kobe.